So, how you doing there, friends? It is so good to be back at Philly.net. My name is Jeff Fritz. I am a principal program manager on the .NET and Visual Studio teams. I have a focus on community, live video, creating content, managing events, and being a part of this community. For those of you that don't know, I've been around Philly.net for a long time. This is where, Bill let me give a 15-minute talk about 10 years ago. And it really jump-started my career. So I encourage you, hang out, check out events, check out user groups like Philly.net. It is fantastic to be home because this is where I got my start. And I'm thrilled that the team has offered to let me start this evening, start talking about things that happened at dotNetConf. And we're going to talk about the big announcements around the updates to C# and C# 10. All kinds of new features coming in here that are all around a similar theme, and I hope these are things that you're going to enjoy, things that you're going to use, and that are available to you now as you go forward using .NET 6. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about the new .NET 6 minimal approach that you're going to start to see, and it exists throughout the entire framework. You're going to see a lot of this happening where we want to reduce the amount of boilerplate code, the amount of stuff that you need to write in order to work with .NET. We want to allow you to get right to your code, writing your business logic, building your application, and get rid of some of those boilerplate things that you've seen that have been part of the framework, part of the tools, the templates from the get-go. So let's start off by minimizing the code to get started. This is a feature that was really made available to you in C# 9, but we have that same program CS that's available everywhere. And that program CS, it has the startup. It has, here's where we start our application. Right here in this example, when we start an ASP.NET Core application, look at this. Namespace my app. Public class program, public static void main string args, create host builder args build run. This is all boilerplate goo that you need to maintain in your application that's built with .NET 5 or earlier, because this is how you bootstrap and start an ASP.NET Core application. Now, that's fine and dandy. That works. But why are you maintaining this? Unless you're changing the way that the web host starts, the way that the Kestrel web server starts. And we know from scanning GitHub and looking at how folks are using the framework, not many people change this. This default isn't really used or changed much. So let's minimize and get rid of that and simplify things so that we have a better way for you to get to your code faster. Let's turn it into one line of code. Builder equals web application create builder args. App equals builder.build, and that's how we're going to build our service container, and we're going to hear about minimal APIs from Rob a little bit later. I don't want to steal his thunder, but this is the template that starts off minimal APIs. Rob's going to tell you more about that later. But instead of having all those lines and then finally write the .run in there, app.run at the bottom. It's immediately easier to get into your code. You get to take advantages of speed enhancements in ASP.NET Core, include and reference existing business logic and features using NuGet. You already know how to do this. And your existing applications, well, they can still work the same way, but we're going to get you in and get you seeing how to interact with your code faster. All right, let's actually get past this concept. Let's actually get hands-on with things. I'm not a fan of slides. Anybody who's seen content that I've presented in the past few years, you know that I don't like slides. I like to write code live. I like to demonstrate things by actually doing and showing you my web browser that has that page I'm going to reference in just a little bit, instead of taking my time and getting to it when I'm ready to. No, I'm actually going to show that now and spoil when everything's going to happen. Bill, I've spoiled the big ta-da moment later. All right, let's make a directory here. Let's call this Philly.net so we can get started over here. And I'm going to jump down into this folder, and let's start by creating a new console application, right? So I'm just going to create a new console application. This is using .NET 6 because of course I have .NET 6 installed on my machine, and I've got a bunch of other .NETs. I work on the .NET team. That's why I've got lots of .NETs. So you see I have 6.0.100 installed. The SDK is right there. And of course I have the .NET Core 6.0 runtime there. Of course I have the ASP.NET Core runtime and the Windows Desktop 6.0 runtime available as well. But I've just now created the all the things I need to run a console app here. So let's jump into that. Thank you, Get Started page. I don't need to see you right now. But let's take a look. And because we're building a console app, of course, Program CS with top-level statements, and this is a feature that's been available to you since C#9, .NET 5 has this. You can interact with and write the very simple hello world. And we think this is a great way for folks to get started learning how to use .NET, right? Because I can start writing things in here and .NET run, and I get immediately coming back. Thanks so much. Yes, I know. There we go. I get hello world, right? And I can do other things in here. Will the Union win this weekend over NYC? And of course, it's easy for new folks to see that, okay, I can control and do things, interesting things, by playing with console write line, writing for loops, and all those things. And it all happens right here in one file. And you as a developer don't have to think much about getting involved with other things. Well, when you want to start working with and building some actual business logic into stuff, you want to build things like a contact class. Maybe you're managing a list of I don't know, customers. You're managing a list of contacts because you're building some sort of communications app. But we can do things here, right? Of course, we know how to do a class. Let's do that with a prop. Thank you. And let's make this city. Now, notice the orange underlines on those two property names. This is nullability, a feature that's been available coming in, and it's saying, hey, this could be null because you didn't initialize it. So you may want to be aware of this. You may want to check in and be able to handle this. So we can put a question mark here to tell it, don't check this for nullability. It's okay if it is null. We know how to handle it. Now that's a feature, once again, that's been around in C# for a while, but now nullability is turned on by default in our .NET 6 projects. We want to encourage better handling of nulls because we feel that that's a feature, that's a interaction that's going to help reduce the number of errors that happen inside your projects. By raising these types of little visual cues inside your applications during the development process, we're going to help you identify where you could potentially have an error somewhere down the line. So by default, nullability is on for you inside these projects. Now, this is a class, but I'm clearly here. I've only got two fields to this. I can actually make this instead, right, from C#9, we know we can make this a record, right? And a record is that same, it's that same type of reference object that is created like a class, right? It's managed on the heap for memory purposes, and we can create and interact with that very easily. Now, there's other ways to declare records so that they have positional type arguments. I could very easily turn this contact into string name, string city, and I have a very simple record here that has two properties defined, and that's nice. But I'm going to keep them broken out as properties like this, and something that's been made available to us as part of C#10 is we can denote that this is a reference type of record by saying public record class. That feels weird, if you were using records with C#9, but you can optionally add the class keyword here to indicate that this is a reference type of record. Why would you want to do that? Because you can also now have a public record struct to indicate that this is a value type. Now, to go back and remember from when we way back in C#1 started working with classes and structs, these are the two different ways that you manage memory. Structs immediately go out of scope when we leave a method, right? They immediately get cleaned up. They were on the stack. They're not on the heap. No garbage collection happens. They immediately get reclaimed as soon as you leave the method or scope that they've been declared in. Now, that's fine. I'm going to leave this as a public record class, and I can create a couple of contacts here. So let's create some contacts. So let's create a new list of type contact, right? And we'll declare a couple of these here. New contact, name equals Fritz. I forgot my property there. There we go. City equals, let's say Norristown, and new contact, name equals, I don't know, Scott. City equals Portland. New contact, one more in here. Name equals Kathleen. There we go. City equals Denver. All right. So I've got a handful of classes here. That's easy for us to see, and I can write a little for loop here, right? I can do for each. Come on, give me that for each. For each. Thank you. Var item in contacts, right? And I can just say console write line, and let's just say, come on, item dot name. Thank you. And we'll put the city there, item dot city. Okay. And I can run this, and I'm going to get my list of, I should have got, I got an extra. There we go. There it goes. So I wrote very quickly here, way to create a couple contacts, output their information, and it's all in one file. No big deal. There it is, outputting just a little bit of information. Now, if these were records, I would have gotten similar type of format because there's an inherent two-string formatting that's available inside of records. Now, that's nice. There's a couple things that happened there as I was writing that code that I'm not sure you caught that I want to walk back and take a look at. Check this out. When I said new list here, right? Let's get rid of that comment. We don't need no stinking comments. When I said new list, it didn't prompt me that hey, Fritz, you don't have a using statement for system collections generic. Where is that? Where'd it go? There's a feature now as part of C#10 called implicit usings. And by default, it's turned on inside your project file right here on line 6. Implicit usings is a way for us to say, you know what? These are some of the using statements that just about everybody uses inside their applications. Let's make those available by default globally inside the project. Now, that sounds a little magic. You're going to supply some using statements for me, Microsoft, that you think I'm going to need. I don't like this magic. Fine, you don't like that. You don't have to include this statement. You can actually just delete it and it's disabled. And if I go back over to here, after it's been saved, now it's going to come back and say, well, I don't know what these things are. It doesn't know what console is because, right, the system namespace hasn't been included. So if you can include it, you can turn it off by adding the disable keyword here. I think you're going to want it because it generates a file and it's sitting here inside the object inside the obj folder. And if we open this up and look just a little bit further and peek under the hood here, we will see, there it is, look at this, Philly.net global usings.g.cs. .g.cs, that's the notation that we use to indicate that this is a generated file. So let's take a peek in that, and you'll see another new feature introduced with C# 10, global usings. Now it's decorated with this auto-generated comment at the top, but there are these using statements that are marked with the global keyword to indicate these are available everywhere. Now, based on the project type that was specified, and if we take a look here, this is Microsoft .NET SDK, we're going to bring in these 7 using statements by default. And when you look at them, I bet if you thought about some of the projects that you were working on, you wandered around and looked at a couple of C# files, I bet at least 4 of these are in most of those files. The top 4 using statements inside your C# files are probably present here. Using system, I can almost guarantee is in every one of them. System link is probably in a bunch of them, and system collections generic, I bet, is there as well. Now, that's fine. Maybe system threading task, maybe you don't get into those quite so much, but as soon as you start using async await and you're returning and working with tasks, you're probably going to start to see those using statements appearing in other files as well. Now, we generate different using statements for different types of projects that you might be working on. So now let me go back to that other web browser, because I want to show you we have a help document that includes the list of those namespaces that we generate and put into your project when you turn on implicit usings. So you saw I'm using Microsoft Net SDK, and these 7 namespaces are added by default. When you're building an ASP.NET application, we're going to include those 7, and we're going to add in these additional, 4, 5, these additional 9, including SystemNet, HTTP, JSON, a bunch of ASP.NET Core capabilities, things to work with configuration, dependency injection, hosting, logging, which makes sense when you're building a web application. You need to touch and interact with the logger. You need to work with HTTP because, let's face it, you're building a web application. So we make these things that make sense for your project available by default for you. If you're building a worker service project, right, because you want to build some sort of a service that's headless and hanging out in the background, we include the Microsoft Net SDK, that first 7, and then these 4, which, once again, they make sense. Configuration, dependency injection, hosting, logging. Yeah, you use all those. And when you're building Windows Forms in WPF, we change around and have a couple of these added in as well. System drawing, system Windows Forms for WinForms, and of course, we remove System IO and SystemNet HTTP when you're building with WPF. We don't think you're going to need those quite so much, so they're not included by default. Now, these are defaults. These are implicit usings. If you want to define and add your own using statements, you can write your own global using statement inside of whatever C# file inside your project. So let's take this contact object, right? And I'm going to get rid of the record keyword there. Let's get rid of that, and let's move this to another file. And you know what? Let's get serious with this. I'm going to put this into a models folder, and I'm just going to tuck that right underneath there. Yeah, I do want to move it over there. Thanks so much. So now I have my contact over here, and it's inside a models folder. Well, I'm of course going to want to put this in a namespace like this, and do one of these, and move that down there, and fix the spacing. I like to use 2-tab spacing, and looks good. So the models here, in order for us to use that over here, of course, I could certainly do right control dot and get a using model statement, but I mentioned you can put your own global usings out here as well. So I'm going to just create another file over here, and I'm going to call it usings CS. I've been taken to calling this underscore usings CS. That's my convention. We don't have a best practice for how to name these things yet. But I go back to, as a web developer, I go back to the underscore imports, right? The imports file that I have in ASP.NET Core, where I'm importing Razor references. I want to use a similar naming convention inside my console applications, WinForms, WPF, where I don't so much have Razor files. And to me, this feels like a good naming convention because it also bubbles that using statement to the top. So I'll just create a global using, and I'll just type models here. If I go back over to program, notice that's grayed out. I can remove that unnecessary using because it's in the global using statement. And now I've customized my application so that it has this extra set of things that it knows how to use by adding a global using statement. So one of the things that the C# team is pointing towards, is thinking about, and one of the things that they've said kind of under their breath off to the side is, we think using statements are going to be something that developers in the next generation are going to not really use that much. They're going to be kind of stashed away, and you're not going to really need to use using statements. That'd be kind of a powerful thing. Thinking of all the places and ways that we've had to generate and use using statements, that'd be pretty amazing if we didn't have to use them at some point in the future of C# development. We'll see how it evolves, but I think now this is much more concise. Startup file to just create a list of contacts, output their information, easy to work with. I can go back over, there's my usings file, that's fine. My contact is over here. And I'm still looking at this and going, there's too much going on here. Check this out. That namespace models, right? And everything's indented here. So many spaces, so much just extra stuff that we don't really need. Once again, we looked at GitHub, we did some analysis, and we saw that folks don't actually put more than one namespace in a file. Like seriously, like 99.999999% of the files that we analyzed on the public GitHub repositories, they've only got one namespace per file. So why do we really need this whole block level statement? Let's get rid of that. And the next C#10 feature that I want to talk about is deleting a class. No, is file scoped namespaces. Just declare the namespace at the top of the file, and everything that's in that file belongs to that namespace. Done. Oh, you need to support multiple classes or objects in different namespaces in that file? You can continue working the same way you were. Just wrap it in the block level statement like you were, and away you go. Now, that's perfectly fine. Nothing changes for folks that do use multiple namespaces, but for the 99.9% of us that do have one namespace per file, everything's simplified. One line, move on, and it feels good. Now, I have the namespace declared here. I created that little usings file over here. If I don't want to put this using file over here, maybe you want to stash it somewhere else, you can also hide these values inside your project file. So I can create an item group here if you'd like. Thank you, item group. And I can put a using statement in here, and I can just say using include equals models. I can comment that out, and my program file still looks clean. I'll run that again, and I'll get our 3 contacts being reported. Thanks so much. The exact same way. Why would you want to do things inside the project file instead of a little C# file? It feels like it's kind of hidden over here. You can't exactly go search for it. If you put your using statements inside a project file like this, now you can turn it into build properties. You can turn it into directory properties. Stash that as another file inside your solution, and now all of your projects get that same set of using statements being passed through. Maybe you've got a common set of base objects sitting in a core library you want to share in all your projects. Put an item group like this, and now you get that same using statement for foocompany.core, or whatever your namespace might be, inside of all your projects. Real easy to use, and just simplify, eliminate code that really was just noise inside your files that if you were like me, you were using the collapse feature inside of .NET to hide some of these things that inside of Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code to hide these statements. You don't need them. Go away. I don't want that anymore inside my files. So for right now, I'm just going to comment that out, and I'll re-enable that over there because that's where I like it to be. So I've got my contact over here. Let me create. Let's create one more thing here. I want to create a new file inside that models folder, and let's call this utilities before my time runs up here and I stumble into Chris's talk about Visual Studio and GitHub. So let's create that namespace, and this was models. So let's create a public static class, utilities, sure. And let's create a method here that's going to help validate some arguments. So public static void validate argument, okay, and string some parameter name, I don't know, some condition that we want it to check, and this is the next feature, the last feature I want to call out here. This is going to be a caller argument. Not exception, expression. There we go. And I want it to inspect the condition value here. And I'm going to get some sort of a message coming out of that. I don't have my bracket in the right place. Good. All right. So this comes out of compiler services. And what we can do here is we can quite easily say if condition, check this out, throw new argument exception, and I want to raise whatever my validation message is, and pass in whatever the parameter name is as the argument exception we were having a problem with. So what I can do, this caller argument expression will actually look at whatever was passed in to this parameter and return that as a string. Check this out. Let me go back over to contact. Let's create a validate. So public void. Now let's do bool is valid here, right? And let's say right. I just have it say validate argument. Sure. Now, hang on. I'm changing my demo on the fly here because I was doing it wrong. Here we go. So validate. So I can do something like right, utilities dot, now validate argument. No, validate argument. Thank you. And the parameter name. Let's inspect the city, and we want to say not string is null or empty. City, and now the message that we want. Oh, no, we're good, right? So I want to pass that through and just validate that argument. Let me go back over to my program, and let's take this. I'll put it right here. Let's say var invalid contact equals new contact. Name equals Bill, and Bill doesn't have a city, even though we know it's Philly. So now I can say invalid contact validate, run that, and of course it's going to fail validation, and it says system argument exception, string is null or empty, parameter city. So it output exactly the message, the string of what I called, passing into, right, this message that it output is exactly the code that I sent in. So the caller argument expression allows us to capture that and pass that along into this string parameter that we can then work with. Really cool capability that's going to allow you to build all kinds of validation tools and abilities to interact with your code. I'm just about over on time. I am over on time. So I want to show you just a quick list of all the new features that are available. I showed you implicit usings, global usings, file scope namespaces. I showed you record structs. There's ability to do things with interpolated strings now, including interpolated strings as constants. I showed you caller expression attributes, but you can work with lambdas now a little bit more freely as types. There's extended property pattern matching that you can interact with. Check out more at the blog post that I've linked there, devblogs.microsoft.com/.net/welcome to C# 10. All right, with that, friends, I am out of time. I'm going to say thank you so much and hand it off to Chris.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was awesome. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, sound good.
Okay, great. Let me see how quickly I can get my screen shared here, because we are definitely flying tonight, right?
Oh yeah,
so,
take it away, my friend.
All right, so here we go. We're going to talk about some features in Visual Studio 2022, and that could easily be a 1 to 2 hour talk. So instead, I'm hoping that plucking a few things, some of them related to the changes with how you can use Git and GitHub, and then if we have time, maybe a couple cool features inside the IDE itself. But I want to start out in Visual Studio 2019. We saw a whole new Git experience. Instead of it being integrated into Team Explorer, it was there's a new Git Changes tab. And first of all, I want to make sure now, is my screen showing two little browsers here pointing to GitHub sites?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, good. All right, cool. Then that way I don't just start talking without making sure that this works. Okay, so in Visual Studio 2022, some of the new features to Git support include, there's a couple of new features. One of them is under the experimental tab. We're going to look at it real quick here, and I'll show you where you can find that and enable it if this is something that appeals to you. So here in GitHub, I have two repositories. This is a web application that's just simply called PDN, and then here for Philly.net, and then here is a library. It's going to be our fun math library, and this library is being consumed in Philly.net. So this might appeal to some of you, a scenario where you say, hey, I have libraries in their own repositories. Maybe I make NuGet packages out of them, but I like to code them in a single solution. And there's this friction, especially in the Visual Studio IDE of, well, hold on, I like using the Git support in there, but really only one repository is supported. So there is a multi-repository feature, and let me get Visual Studio loaded here. So Visual Studio is up, and in order to activate this feature, so if you're rushing to Visual Studio 2022 right now, because this is really exciting for you, first you're going to want to go to Tools, Manage Preview Features, or if you're like me and you forget where stuff is, you can type multi-repo in Control Q or the search box, that search box in the upper top of the screen to the right of help. This is wonderful. This is where I look up just about everything in Visual Studio 2022, especially because I forget where things are all the time. And the feature we want is enable multi-repo support. That is unchecked by default, so I've already checked it. So now that I've turned that feature on, if I open, I've already cloned those two repositories that you see there. So on my machine, this is pretty hard to see, so I will explain what you're seeing. In my source folder, the PDN repo is in a folder called PDN. That's like the website, and then it consumes the maths library, which is just, I cloned that, and so it's in its own folder. But if I open this solution, and this solution already knows about the maths library project, it's already consuming it, then Solution Explorer opens it up just fine, like it always has. But what we see in the bottom right, and it's pretty far off to the bottom right, is Visual Studio has shown the repository that you're working in the bottom right, and now it says two repositories. That might be unusual for folks not used to that. It shows the branch that is currently checked out in Git verbiage. What is your current branch? That's listed here as well. So it just took a look at those two folders it knows that the solution is consuming this project in another folder, and it says, hey, that's a different repository. So that's kind of neat. If this is something that this kind of eluded you for a while, to say, hey, I feel like I'm keeping two Visual Studios open and so on. So how does that work in practice? Like, this is a pretty simple project, and it's not really all that important what the project does. Instead, what I want, and we'll run the project, but what I want to kind of zoom in on here, so to speak, is this particular math library. You know, it's pretty straightforward. It's just providing you a method that adds. And then over in the Blazor project, this math razor page, which lets you put in a couple values and click a button to add them up, it's consuming that add method. So something that might be a common scenario is you say, oh, well, you know what, we need to have subtract now. So let's add that very quickly, because again, this is more about the Visual Studio's Git experience. Now, Visual Studio is kind of figuring out what I probably want here. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit tab and let it finish the subtract method for me. So that was kind of neat. And then if I head back over, why is it complaining about that? I find that odd. Maybe when I build it, that'll go away. Oh, I know why. Because I didn't give it a return type. And thank you. I'm sure some other folks spotted that too. So, so yeah, we got a return type, and now let's use it. That's in a different project now. The mass library now has a new method. And if I go to the Git Changes tab now, so we have our Solution Explorer and Git Changes. If you haven't moved this in your IDE, Git Changes is sitting here in the lower right. And it recognizes, hey, you know, you've made a change to that file. Well, if I consume it in this other project, which actually exists in a different repository, I consume that and I hit save, it can see that happening across both repositories just fine. And again, not necessarily the point here, because I'm concentrating on the Git. We're going to see Blazor with Bill in a little bit, but I can make the change. You know, I can quickly test the change, and I can see that if I put in like 8 and 3 and the answer is 5. So great, my change works. In the Git Changes tab, up here at the top, it's recognizing I'm working across both repositories. Now I can change this by clicking on this drop down and say, just show me what's going on in the math library. I want to separate my commit. Maybe that's something you want to do. And you can enter your commit message here like before and click commit, and commit all here to commit every one of these files. I've only made one change. But I'm going to go ahead and try out this cross repository feature. So here I can say added a subtract method to library and in app. So when I say commit all repos now, it's going to apply a commit to each repository. Okay, it can't be magical about how Git works. They have to be separate commits, one for each repository, because that's how Git thinks. But if I want to see the status of what Visual Studio calls outgoing commits, then you have this little underline here that's kind of hinting at you. Well, what if I click here? Well, I get to see the two different repositories are represented with the little Git symbol, the orange Git symbol, and we're here on the trunk branch, and it's saying, hey, when you click push, I'm going to send this commit, add a subtract method to the library and in the app, but I'm going to send it to if you click push on here, I'm going to send this commit. So there isn't, at least as far as I've seen and as far as I've been able to research, I couldn't find a one-size-fits-all push method, but I was able to commit to both. I could review that commit really quickly. I double-click on the commit in the graph, and I happen to have my code windows pretty large, but I could review, oh yeah, in this commit I added subtract. Let me head back over to this repository, take a look at this commit. Oh, and in this commit I use subtract. Okay, so I can hit push in each of these, and Visual Studio will go ahead and push that up to the remote, right? And this is how a lot of people work, by especially at work, we pull from an origin remote. That's the name Git will give it when you clone from that central repository you probably work on. And so this is a pretty common workflow. The multi-repo feature, it's in preview. There is a blog entry that discusses this, and I'm going to make sure that you get all of these links. In fact, I think I have a tab at the end. The reason I'm not going to share it now is because there's videos in there. And so when you open this link of links, then about 5 videos are going to start, and that maybe we don't want that right now. Personalizing your Git settings. Like I said, I'm the kind of person that tends to forget where features are. So I'm going to type Git settings in Control Q or in that handy search everywhere box in Visual Studio. And I get setting. Oh, it's saying, oh, well, maybe you want settings, Git settings. And it is what I want. So your Git global settings are exposed here. There is a little bit of an intermingling here between your Git config. If I change that email, that's going to affect the Git config because it's the global settings. But then here's something that's not necessarily part of Git config is, well, where do you want me to clone stuff by default? So if you're really like a heavy Git user and you're really used to like maybe command line usage and what Git config means, you might look at this and say, well, I see a little bit of mingling here. And you may or may not, that just may or may not be what you want. But you can also add a Git config. This will help override local settings for your repository. If you drop down one to Git repository settings, you can override local settings in your repository as well. So what other things can you do? Let's open a different project, or do I already have it open? I want to double check if I do. I do want to stop debugging this. I do already have this other project open here. But this one is not in source control. So here's what we'll do instead is we're going to open another Visual Studio very quickly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to built into Visual Studio now in the Git Changes tab, also on the start page, is a clone repository button. You can also find this on the start page, which I disable it, but I can always get it back by searching for start window, and it looks like this. So you can go straight to cloning a repository and getting to work. And I do have one. Hopefully I don't have this shouldn't be too far away. Okay, perfect. I have forked the .NET Interactive project. You might have all seen that presentation a little bit earlier. Why is this workflow useful? Because if you want to help work on open source like .NET, you are probably going to fork the repo first. You're going to click the fork button. So now a clone of the repo is in your GitHub account. And why is that? Because they don't just give all of us rights to push directly to the main repo. We're going to send pull requests. But the workflow for that can be tricky for folks. So what I'm going to do very quickly is try to get this cloned very fast, and it should go quick, and show you a couple features that you might be interested in if this is the kind of workflow that you want inside Visual Studio. For one, I'm not too interested about any of these projects. I'm more interested about what's going on in the Git Changes menu. So in the upper right of the Git Changes menu, I still have the ability to go through branches and basically say, hey, I've only got the main branch cloned, and that's fine. I could look at the branches on the remote. Maybe I'm interested in what's one of the people working on this is doing. I can also customize these buttons up here. There's a fetch, a pull, a push, and a sync. Now, if you know me, you know that I'm not a big fan of the sync button because it does all kinds of operations at once. It pushes and pulls, and I don't like using it. But what's great is I can come in here and I can say, go down. I can click this extra operations button, the 3 dots, go down to the show toolbar actions, and I can uncheck sync. And so for me, it's gone. And that's something I like. But you'll also notice that there's other things that I can do here. I can fetch from a specific remote and so forth here. So I cloned from my own repo. Okay, but when I when things change in the main repo, you might be used to the idea of having a second remote, a remote that's pointing back to the original repository. But I don't have that set up. So what's an easy way to do that? Well, in this extra operations menu, I can click open in browser, and it takes me directly to my copy of the repo because that's what I cloned. And what's really convenient on the GitHub site is I can go directly to where I forked from and use the code button to copy the original URL of the original repository. Then I can go to click on this extra operations button and say manage remotes. And this is something I can do now. I can add a remote directly within Visual Studio. You can do all this stuff from command line or your favorite tool if you're used to it as well. They all play pretty nicely together. But this is like saying git remote add. So I can click add remote. I'm going to go ahead and enter it here. And a common convention for the original remote that you're going to be sending pull requests to is a lot of people like to call it upstream. You can call it anything you want. You can call it mine. It really doesn't matter. But by clicking save here, now I have the ability when I work, which we're not going to get to any specific change here, but if I work, commit some changes to my own repository, and I want to push them specifically to a place, I can do that. And if I want to pull the changes from upstream to see, well, hold on, I want to see what they've been working on, I can do that as well. I now have this option from within this little additional operations menu. So those are some of the Git features. I think we have time to look at one more feature, and I'm going to concentrate on the Visual Studio 2022 side, but I want to make it clear that this is a .NET 6 and wider feature. It's hot reload. It's one of the things that I think folks have been really excited about. We only have time for a simple example, okay? So in this simple example, I created a console app, and this is using top-level statements, just like Jeff showed a little while ago. So in this console app, just the C# compiler turns this into a main function, and then I can go ahead and start writing new classes, right? So here we are with our friend, the math class again. And if I run this, okay, let me show you after I run this, let me get the console over here, get a little bit bigger so we can all see. But because we're stuck on one screen, we're going to have to do a little bit of moving around here. Okay, so what's new in Visual Studio 2022 here? Well, we have this button, the hot reload button. I've already, I think this sticks, I've already gone ahead and checked hot reload on file save. So the application's running, it's already written the first line out, this hello world, it's already written that out. And it's set this integer x equal to 7, and it is going to now run another console write line where it uses the math add method that's just declared down here. And this is pretty simple. It's going to write out that x is 10. So let's just go ahead and I'm just going to go ahead and hit F10. And we see that works. That's fine. But what if I was in the middle of stepping through this code and I said, oh, wait a second, I didn't want subtract to be 7 minus 3. I wanted it to be 7 minus 7. Oh, and I forgot to change it. So what happens to us? We hit stop. We go work on the code. We rebuild it, whatever. That's really quick in a 18-line demo. But what if the application was much larger? So what I'm going to do is just right here, I'm going to say that the second argument is 7. So 7 minus 7 is going to be 0. Well, the breakpoint went away, but the arrow's still here. And I did say the hot reload file on file save. I did have that checked earlier. So all I'm going to do is hit the save button. I could also hit Control S. And the breakpoint sort of reactivates. It's kind of like Visual Studio's telling you, like, okay, I did what you asked. That code got injected in there through the magic, the power of hot reload. And when I hit F10 now, that took effect. X is 0. The original code is not what took effect there. So this works in not just in console apps. There is a video that I'm linking that shows the hot reload support for ASP.NET Core and Blazor, and another video that Scott Hanselman did where he went through this support using Visual Studio 2022 VS Code, and even just to show you that it's not relying on tools, used like Notepad at the end of it. So let's run this one more time I'm going to click the restart application to get to the top here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do something before this line of code even runs. I'm going to edit it, and I'm going to add like some, make it really, really exclamatory here, like yes, lots of exclamation marks. And I'm going to hit Control S to save, and it takes effect, right? I didn't have to restart the application. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a multiply method while we're here. And when hot reload can't take advantage of something, there is something that Visual Studio does to denote that. So I've added this multiply method. I'm still running the app. I'm going to change this to use the new multiply method. I'm going to save all that. Let's go ahead, and we're 7 plus 3 is 10. This is the multiply method now, and I just changed it right here and let it continue with hot reload. 7 times 7 is 49, and it all keeps going. Kind of a contrived demo, but hopefully what we're seeing is, you know, if I'm writing like a bigger service, or maybe I'm using these new minimal APIs, there are some things you can change. Like you can change the implementations of a minimal API. We actually explored this on the Dev Talk Show last week. We played around with what you can and can't change. Now let's run this one more time, and because I want you to see what it looks like when maybe you can't do something. If I change this back to subtract, because we don't really want that method anymore, let's get rid of multiply. Let's save it. Now, I got a message here that said, hey, these changes can't be compiled. I also got purple squigglies. So, you know, red squigglies are how we began our time in IDEs, and now I've seen green and purple. It's fantastic. So that's letting me know that hot reload's not going to work here. I can stop. I can rebuild. So you get that little bit of help for that. Like I said, this works. This is not just a console app feature. You can use it in some of your microservices in certain places. Like, let's say you really like minimal APIs and you want to build these small focused microservices. You can change the implementation of an API. From what I've seen, you can't change what would be in the program CS. That doesn't work. But I would expect continued improvements to this. Don't just think ASP.NET Core. C++ supports this as well. And in the Visual Studio launch videos, this is going to be a fantastic pitch for game developers, which I don't know how many of you here. Game developers compile their code for days on end and then have to play a game or set up a condition to get to a certain point that they want to test. It might take them all afternoon just to find out that they really wanted to change one thing in their C++. And so they got to go do it all again. So there was a specific pitch to game developers in the hot reload, in the Visual Studio launch hot reload video. Like they were reaching out to them saying like, look, this is going to save you a ton of time. I want to share with everyone this here, which I will put into the Teams chat. And if this, if we have to get it to other folks other ways, that should open up a set of links for you. There are videos here. Hot reload for Blazor, hot reload, the hot reload demo using other features like VS Code, Notepad, and so on. The multi-repo support we talked about, the Git experience documentation, the documentation directly for hot reload in ASP.NET Core. The things that we talked about, you might see some other Git features. And then a little plug for the Dev Talk Show, which is the show with Rich Ross, Andy, and I. We are generally 8:30 on Wednesday nights. I have to confirm if we're getting the stream up and ready for 8 o'clock tonight, but we're youtube.com/the Dev Talk Show, and we talked about. We actually did some playing around with hot reload in our last show. We took Thanksgiving Wednesday off. We did some time kind of digging in to see like what works and what doesn't. But hey, here we are a couple minutes early, which is always a good thing because you are going to be super excited to see Blazor and minimal APIs. This is awesome stuff. I hope this helped. There's a ton of new features in Visual Studio 2022 and in .NET 6. We could go a long way talking about those, right, Bill?
Absolutely, yes, as I am muted. Great stuff. And yeah, everybody, if you want to spend your entire night doing this after we're done our 2 hours, join Chris and company for their Dev Talk show. That's a wonderful thing. A couple quick announcements. This is our official dotNetConf launch party, and the idea is to go over things that were released last month. The other things that are coming up in 2 weeks, we have yet another meeting, and Rich Ross is going to do some real interesting new GitHub features that you don't want to miss. So that is on the meetup page for Philly.net. And then if we can get our act together, we are planning to have a little virtual code camp in the first week of January. I don't know how many sessions we'll have, but I would expect at least 2 or 3 dozen. And we're going to start promoting that, looking for speakers. And that is, of course, all free, and it uses this exact same technology. And you'll see links for that posted on Meetup real soon. So with that in mind, if I could figure out how to turn my camera on, you'd think I would know how to do that. Let's see. Well, you don't need to see me. I'm just going to show my screen. So let's. All right. So a little bit about Blazor. Blazor is a web technology that is used to create websites, and when you create them, you use a mix of markup and C# code. This is quite a difference from other products like Angular or React, where you have to be a whiz at JavaScript or TypeScript to make anything useful happen. When I build websites and in my client work, I haven't done a JavaScript website probably in 2 or 3 years. I do everything in Blazor. If time permits, at the end, I'll show you one of the applications I'm working on. But I am going to show you some samples here. So you see on my screen, if you look here at the names, very clever. It's Blazor app 3, 4, 5, and 6. What does that mean? Well, basically, when you make Blazor, what you want to do, I'm going to start a new Visual Studio instance. And we're doing the cooking show approach here because I already have them made, but I want to show you how you might make a new one. So if you create a new project, what you normally do is just type in here Blazor. And you have a choice of 2 things, WebAssembly or server. Technically, there'll be a 3rd choice coming soon. In the first quarter, you're going to see the release of something called .NET MAUI, and Blazor will be a factor there. You will be able to make a Blazor application that runs across phones, Windows desktop, iPads, web, Windows Forms, and also web, all using the same source code. So that's for another day. Today, we could either do WebAssembly or server app. Let's just pretend we were going to make another WebAssembly. And then you have to like give it a name, and then you say next, and you choose a version. Now, Blazor's been around for a couple of years. Almost all my work has been done recently in .NET 5. I'm switching my client stuff over to .NET 6. You'll also notice that there's something called core hosted and progressive web app. I'm going to explain those differences in this half hour. I'm not going to create this because I've already created all of these. So we'll start with this one. And this one is Blazor app 3, and this is a server-side Blazor application. And hopefully I can get you to understand what that means. So in here, what do you have? Well, under dependencies, We have a couple analyzers. No need to get into all of those. And then you have the .NET framework. That makes sense. Then under properties, under launch settings, you'll see it's actually going to come up at sub web host port. You can configure that, change it to your needs. And then Blazor typically has a static file component where you would deliver things like CSS files or something like your favorite icon. So that's pretty standard. Now, in the example application they build here, they add a folder called data. That's just by convention. And what they're doing here is they create a class for their data model called the weather forecast. Notice the use of nullable strings. And then also they create a service called weather forecast service. That's just a class. And what that's going to do is use some async technology, and it's going to return back a task of the type weather forecast. Interesting. Now, all Blazor apps have a pages folder, and in there you put your pages. Pages are also referred to as components. What's the difference? Well, let's take a look. There's something called host CHTML. Interesting. So host says we're going to add a layout and we're going to render something called the app. Now that seems to be the root. So that must be where everything starts. The layout is actually going to define things in HTML like your header, your body, whether you want to load scripts. And yes, there are some little scripts that come as part of the Blazor framework. You will also notice this very important keyword here, render body. That is where all the other Blazor components are going to appear within the HTML page that's rendered. What do I mean by components? Well, the components would be counter, fetch data, and index. You'll notice that each of those have a page directive. That is going to determine their routing. Okay, now it could be very simple where it just has markup, or it could be a little more complex where it has markup and then code. And it's very common with Blazor to work in both, work your code and your markup in the same file. Technically, it's possible to separate them, but most people just do it this way. It's just a common practice. Also notice you can do things in Blazor like inject for dependency injection. And in this case, we're going to inject a weather service. I'll explain more about that in a moment. Finally, in the home page, we have a survey prompt. What is a survey prompt? Well, that in the world of Blazor is called a component. It is made exactly the same as pages do, but what the author chose to do here is put that in the shared section. And that is a mix of code and markup, but notice at the top there's no @page directive. It's meant to be inserted inside other pages. In practice, we call all of these things components, but technically a component, it would be something that's inserted into other pages. Finally, there's an error page. Now you might look at this and say, this one looks a little different. It actually has an HTML a head and a body. And for things like critical errors, where Blazor may stop running and you need to display something to the user, typically what you're doing here is just what we would call a basic razor page. So that's very common. All right, what else do we got in here? We got something called the main layout. The main layout is going to be a wrapper around each component so they can all be consistent. We do that so we can introduce common components like navigation menus. So we're going to have a sidebar that has a nav menu in it, and then we're going to insert the body for each page. This way, when you run this, the sidebar is going to appear for every one of the pages. Notice that counter doesn't have a sidebar or a menu, either does fetch data or index. That is all provided by the main layout. Finally, the nav menu is a component, and that component is going to use a bunch of navlink controls to make a nice little menu. And you'll also notice that it has a little bit of code here so it can play with a toggled menu. To finish our tour of what makes a Blazor app, we're going to look at the imports. An import is similar to what Jeff showed in the first session, sort of like a global using, that is going to make these particular parts of .NET available to all the pages and components in your application. There's something called an app raiser. The app raiser is going to determine what kind of routing you're using. And if the routing doesn't work, then it shows a default not found message. You can get a little fancier if you want here and make it, very pretty with corporate logos and stuff like that. And the last piece of a Blazor app is your program file, your top level file. Notice that this is using top level statements since this is built on .NET 6. It doesn't have the namespace. It doesn't have all the fancy usings and all of the class name and stuff like that. It knows that it's the starting point of the application. And what it does is it says, add something called the app. Well, when it adds the app, that is the thing called app.raiser. Then it adds this thing called, an HTTP client, so we can do some, technically it's doing signal R in the background to send data back and forth. And then it builds and it runs this thing asynchronously. Now, what does this actually look like when you run it? Well, I'll just run this real quick. And let's see what comes up here. Okay, so again, the left nav, this is all part of the main layout and the nav menu component. You'll notice the routing. If you look up at the top here, home just did a / in its at page directive. Counter did a /counter. Fetch data did a /fetch data. How does fetch data actually work? Well, that's interesting. Fetch data is a service. So what you're doing there is you're calling down here, you're doing a get from JSON async, and you're technically reading a JSON file off the disk. And where is that stored? All of your data would be stored in www-root, and there is your JSON file that brings your temperatures. So that's a real quick tour of how Blazor works. Everything's done in C#. There's no JavaScript needed. If you need to do custom JavaScript, there's something called JavaScript interop, and you can add that as needed to any of the pages. But in my work, I've written very complex applications that basically do no JavaScript interop. They just do C#. And that's my happy place. So, all right. Now, I said that this had some, the nav menu had a little bit of fancy code in it, and I'll show you what makes that happen. Using CSS tricks, we're going to sense if the screen gets smaller and we're maybe on a phone. In that case, we're going to put the menu at the top instead of on the side, and we're going to make it so we can toggle the menu. And that's what the code does in the nav menu component. That's all it does. You'll also notice this little block here. This is what's called the survey prompt, and this is a component inserted inside of Hello World. How simple can this be? Well, let's go over here and let's see. We're in the middle of running, and let's go to the index razor page. And in the index razor page, I'm going to go down here and say, I really want to do hot reload on file save. Okay, so what would happen if I inserted a component called counter. Okay, and if I press Control S to save, well, so much for that. I expected it to show up here. Let me see. No, it still didn't show up. So I must have missed something, because hot reload, or it should actually show me that component. Its name is counter, isn't it? Yeah, it's called counter. All right, let's try this again. I'm going to stop this. I'll just run this again. What I want you to see is that a page, here's the counter now. So the counter can work here. It can work there. They're actually separate instances, so they have different counts. But the point is that a page is a component, and you can insert an entire page inside another page if you want. And you basically, the whole thing is done as building blocks that way. All right, so what's going on in the background? I don't really have enough time today to show you, but if you did do your developer tools and you went into network and you did a refresh, you would see that it brings up about, let's see how big it was here, 1.2 megabytes of stuff. So it's pretty small. And inside here, it has a bunch of JavaScript files, and then technically it's using Signal R to send the changes to the HTML, which are technically rendered on the server and then sent in a little Signal R message back and forth to the browser, and the browser knows to take and update just the part of the screen that needs to change. And it's very fast and efficient. So that, in a nutshell, is how Blazor server works. Let me show you another one. So that was this one was Blazor server. Now, there's something called WebAssembly. So WebAssembly is the ability to run and render the HTML on the browser side. This makes a lot less traffic and a lot less work for the server, but it puts more of the work onto the client. What does a WebAssembly version of Blazor look like, and how is it slightly different from this one? So I'm going to take these two and sort of position them so you can see that. And you will see that the dependencies, you have something in a WebAssembly, you have these packages that you have to add. See, they're called WebAssembly, Dev Server, and WebAssembly. All of this happens for you automatically when you create this. Next thing, you still have the launch settings. That hasn't changed. It looks a little more complicated. Under the WW root, they put the sample data again in the same place. And they have something new. They have an index.html. You'll notice that the index.html defines the wrapping HTML, the top level header, and the body. And then in here, it says, I'm going to load Blazor WebAssembly JS. When we were on the server side version, we did not have an index HTML, but we did have an underscore host. Or excuse me, not underscore host. Yeah. Underscore layout, my mistake. Okay, notice that this one loads Blazor server JS. And then when you're doing WebAssembly, it loads Blazor WebAssembly JS. And this little div here is where it's actually going to throw your bodies. The one here, ID of app, that's where it's going to put your body of your information. The components are identical. If you look at counter.razor in a WebAssembly, it uses the exact same code as counter.razor on the server side. So there's a lot of possibility for reuse of components, and you can package them in a separate project and share them across multiple applications. Fetch data, basically doing the same nonsense. The difference here is they put the data model class right here because this is the only place it's used, and they're loading from the exact same place using a get JSON from async. Everything else looks the same. If we go to main layout, same idea, that hasn't changed. Nav menu hasn't changed. Survey prompt hasn't changed. So all your components are very consistent. Your app razor, same basic idea. Now, what is different is the program. The program is slightly less complicated. Again, if we looked at program over on the server side, you'll see you're doing things like adding razor pages. You're adding a service called Weather Forecast Service as a singleton. And you do that so when you go into fetch data, you can inject that and have dependency injection, which is a wonderful thing to have across all your components. But we don't need that on the client side because we don't need that in the WebAssembly. But we do add two components. One is the app, and in .NET 6, this is new, they add this thing called the head outlet, and that's the actual head section of an HTML page. And that's so you can do things like add meta tags and change page titles and things like that. So, you know, minor differences. Let's run this, and you'll see that the look and feel is going to be almost identical. It loads, and you have basically the same application. But, you know, there must be some difference. If you go into the developer tools and go into console, first thing you'll notice, as it says, this was built with linking tree shaking disabled. What does that mean? Well, tree shaking is the ability to take and reduce the size of the payload needed to send all the stuff down to the client, because the client has to have the whole application, and it runs it in an interpreter based on what is called the Mono project at Microsoft. And I'll show you that. If we go to network here and do a refresh, you will see that it downloaded. Excuse me?
Hello.
Yeah, unmute,
So
please.
you're coming in Abhi's car because Krishna uncle said that he's going to pick up, and then he said Abhi's dad is going to pick up.
All right, keep talking. All right, notice that this downloaded about 1.3 megabytes of resources, and if you were to look at here, it downloads a different set of information than it did as a server app. And I don't have time to go through and show you in detail how all that works, but it actually downloads the binaries, the compile DLL. And if I can find that. Okay. Well, I'm going to skip over that part, but that's basically what's happening here. And so that's WebAssembly. And you would choose WebAssembly if you're going to do work that is, you know, sort of graphic intensive, that you want to keep the traffic between the client and the server minimal. It works in most major modern browsers. No, it doesn't work in IE 11. Stop asking that question. But you know, all the other stuff, the WebAssembly works fine. Really useful. Try it out. So that was WebAssembly. Now, when you make a WebAssembly, in the default mode, which is this one here, it only makes a single project. And the single project, it's basically like an SPA, a single page application. And it just assumes that whatever app.razor is the starting point, and that's what you get on the screen. If you want to do something more interesting and complicated, you probably want to have some back-end services on your web server and have an interaction between that back-end website and the WebAssembly app running on the client. In that case, you would choose what's called an app-hosted or a core hosted Blazor app. So this one, which I call Blazor app 5, is that example. And how does that differ from the two I just showed you? Well, it makes 3 separate projects. It makes a client project, a server project, and a shared project in one solution. You'll notice that the client project has the same packages we saw earlier that are for WebAssembly, but it also references shared. What is it getting out of shared? The only thing in shared is a single class that is the model for the weather forecast data. So that model is going to be used on the back end the server project and on the front end. So this is an example of how you would share your data types between the back end server and the front end WebAssembly. Next, under www-root, you'll notice that this no longer has the data in it. What did they do with the data? Well, the data is now in the back end server. So if we look in the back end server, it's going to have a controller. And the controller is going to have an API that returns the weather service. So this is more a traditional ASP.NET MVC type API. And so it has an endpoint, and the front end can call this endpoint, and the endpoint is going to return back the data based on this. They don't actually read it from JSON. They just create it from this string array that they build in memory. How does that work? The page in the front end, when it does a fetch data, it's just going to get JSON from async, but it's going to just call weather forecast instead of giving it the path to a file. And weather forecast is actually the root of this controller. By convention, you take and remove the word controller, and that becomes your URL. So /weather forecast actually returns the data for you. Okay, you don't need any pages in the server side because all it's going to do is return back data from, say, a SQL database or whatever web API you need to build. The program is fairly simple here. It still maps the Razor page, but instead of having the fallback is the host_host file, it is actually now the index.html file. And you'll say, well, where is that index.html? it's not in the www root because the server doesn't have a www root, but the client does. And that's this index.html here. How do you tie all this together? Well, that's done by project dependencies. So again, the client is going to rely on the shared, but the server is going to rely on the client and the shared. And then it knows by doing that, that it can have as its start page the same client application that we're used to. So if we run this, it does basically the same thing the other ones do. They all look the same. Got it. Have a nice day. So there you go. It does the exact same thing. How exciting. Okay. Finally, I have like 2 minutes left. I have one more variation, and that variation is a progressive web app. So that's a very common thing to do. I think eventually progressive web apps will lose favor as people understand more about MAUI next year. But for now, it's still a valid application alternative. What does a progressive web app do for you? It adds a manifest file. The manifest file indicates some metadata, including your icons, things like that. And then it adds something called the service worker. The service worker is code that runs on the browser that can do things like get the weather forecast in the background and cache them so that if you have to go offline, you can actually see the weather forecast until you get back online. Not all of that's wired up, but they give you the basic, start of how to build that. Other than that, this application is exactly the same as the one I showed you before, with the exception of the index.html. It has to add these extra lines to make the manifest available to the browser so that it knows a progressive web app is running. Also on the bottom, it has to add some the service worker JavaScript. And when you run this, the only difference is the app is going to look exactly the same. It still does the counter, the fetch data. However, you have this little extra button up on your browser and it says, hey, do you want to install this? And if you install it, it'll actually make a icon on your desktop that lets you run this application directly from your desktop. And it makes it feel more like it's a built-in Windows app, even though very few people use Windows apps. But it's a cool thing to do. When you run the browser tools, function 12, I might point out under application, there is a thing called the manifest. It actually shows you the manifest stuff. It shows you whether you have service workers. So it's a good thing to learn how to work with this. Highly recommended. Hopefully you got some, at least some understanding of what Blazor is and how it makes web pages using all markup and C#. At this point in time, I am going to turn this over to Mr. Keiser, who represents the nation of minimal APIs.
All right. Let's see what we got going on here.
You have a big circle behind you.
Do I have a big circle behind me?
Yes.
I'm trying to remember what screen though I'm working with here. Yeah, I guess I got the right one. Can everybody see that? I hope everybody can see that.
Looks good enough.
I saw a little, oh, sorry. Didn't mean to do that. All right, cool. So earlier today, Fritz showed
some a minimal stuff. He showed a little bit of a minimal API. He did it in 4 lines. I'm going to better him by 1 and do it in 3 as the basic one. But before I get to that, I wanted to show you that this is the only 2 files I have sitting in my directory here. This is all there is. I set up, and I did this by hand. I didn't even use anything to do this. So I have a project file, CS project file, which is .NET SDK.web, and I have a program file. And there it is. There's a minimal API. That's all you need. So you set up the web application. You map the get call. And this is a little lambda here that's going to return back that string. And then we run it. So if we give this a shot, see if we can make this actually work. See if it actually does run. Just did some bin object stuff there. It's building a bunch of stuff. And there, so it's running. So something to look at here. I didn't tell it what port to listen on, but by default, and there's no launch settings or anything else. So I did it this way so that you could see there's only 2 files. So by default, it's listening on 5000 and 5001. And it's in a production hosting environment. Probably something you'd probably want to have that changed. But if you set this up using the utilities that are available, by default, you'd be in a development environment. But I just want to do things with as few files as possible. Now, I'm going to add one more file here just so I can show that this is actually working and not have to go back and forth between a web browser and my screen here. So I'm going to add a file just so we can run some stuff. And let's see. This is going to use my REST API. So you can see down here, I just executed a GET call. It ran it. It came back with a 200. Here's the results. Hello, Philly.net. It works. Da-da. Isn't that wonderful? So again, I said it by default, it's at 5000. So let's go back and see if we can make some changes here. So you don't have to run it on 5000. I could tell it, you know, I want to run this at localhost 3000. In there. And we can rerun this. And now if I go over to this, this should not work anymore. I should get, yep, couldn't get there. So if I change this to a 3 and run it, it just worked. Just ran again. There it is. Works great. Now you may want to say, well, you know, I don't necessarily, well, I want to be a little special. So rather than run it at 3000 only, let me run it at 3000 and 5000. Why not? I should be able to do that, right? So you can. So we can set up the ability to run it at different URLs. So I'll run it at 5000 and run it at 3000. So should we be able to run it both? We do this, save that, and rerun it. So now you can see down here, we're running it on, listening on 5000 and on port 3000. So we're running it at both places. So this should still work. And it just did. And I could change it to 5 and this should still work. And that still does as well. Everything's working fine. All right. So what else we want to do? Well, map get makes sense. That allows us to do a get. But what happens if we want to do something else? So you can add all the different verbs you want to put in here. You can do post. You can put it at the same place. And then write a little lambda here that just does post. And then you can do the same thing again. Or put. And for delete, we'll fix this up here. Put this delete. Yeah, I'm a little inconsistent with my casing, but that's okay. So if we rerun this now, I should, let's grab some of this stuff over here. Running, it's listing on ports 5,000 and 3,000. Let's add a few more of these things in here. So if we do a send request for a post, this is a post. We do a put, this is a put. And we do a delete, and that's a delete. Ta-da. So everything seems to be working. Again, notice there is no special stuff here. This is just a bunch of lines put here. I mean, it almost looks like a script. Take that node. So let's see, what else we got? All right, so right now I just did the lambdas directly. You don't have to do it this way. We could say, well, you know, I want to have a variable that does a lambda, right? You can do it this way. And we can change this. So instead of doing the get that way, you can just simply say, I want to pass in the handler. All right, so we don't have to write all the code all in one line like that or all in one big section. We could split things out if we want to, which chances are we do. But we can do things like this. Save this. And we'll go back to our demo. And we'll execute this get call again. And it says this is a lambda. Simple enough. Seems to work just fine. Now, we can also do this in a class. So say you wanted to set up a class, you could do that. Hello handler. And return. The way Bill likes to do it, lowercase thing. There we go. And then obviously we have to fix this a little bit. So we're going to say do hello handler. And this one would be handler.hello. So now we've got a class that we're calling, and we're passing that into our get. So this is, you can see how we could evolve this thing into something a lot more complex, but still it's pretty simple. There's very minimal amount of code that we actually have to write for this stuff, because a lot of the stuff's happening behind the scenes. It knows what we really want. Oh, good. I didn't make any mistakes. So we send, and it's back to that hello Philly.net from the class this time. So there you go. And by the way, if there's any questions, just speak up. I'm fine with that. All right.
Hey, Rob.
Yes.
That HTTP extension on that demo file there, is that an extension for VS Code specifically?
No. So this is, we showed this before, but basically it is rest. Come on, search. Oh, helps if I hit the right thing here. It's this guy here. It's just an extension.
Oh yeah, it's a VS Code extension. Gotcha. Cool.
Yep.
Thank you, sir.
No problem. All right. Good question. So far, all we've been doing is just returning back a bunch of stuff. Nothing special here. But usually when you have an API, you do more than just return crap. You like to post things too. So let's post some things. So let's just make this a minimal amount of stuff here. Let's just get rid of this for a second, just to just put this in here, move this. I just want to clean this up a little bit so it's not so confusing. I don't think I need this anymore. And if I do, well, too bad. All right. So let's create a person record. And we're going to do this again in a minimal amount of code. So we're not going to do anything fancy. We're just going to do it this way. That's all we really need to create a record. Works fine. So in our post, what we're going to do is we're going to post the person. And we're just going to post it, and we're not going to have any code here. We're just going to do a post just to show that this part at least works. So we can do things like this. Obviously, I have no code in my Lambda here, so nothing's going to happen. But we can at least give it a shot and see if we can actually post a person to our code. So let me grab something over here. Do a new post. All right, so I did something wrong. Oh, no. Argument 3 cannot be convert from string to request delegate. Where did I make a mistake? Oh, this is where I made a mistake right here. Sorry. Killing me. Okay. All right, so let's add, we'll put in a post here. So I know Bill just had a birthday. He's 29, did you know that? Anyway, so we're gonna do a post, accept content type. We're gonna pass in this. This should just work, and it did. Not that we did anything with it. We passed it in, it's now gone. It's not saved anywhere. Well, it's, you know, but you can see down here that we did do the request. We passed in a bunch of stuff, and we know how long it took, and we got a 200 back. So far, we haven't broken anything, and we've actually been able to post something to our web API. So let's actually do something with that. So let's add a few more pieces of code here so we can work with it a little bit. So let's say we want to put in here, we're going to create a person, and we're going to call it memory person. And we're going to put in nothing and a 0 for. If you don't do this, it gets a little upset with you because of the way we created the record. So this is fine. This will work. And then inside of our post, we can simply say, sorry, helps if you, memory person equals person, because that's what we're passing in, right? We're passing in person. So we're going to save that into this variable called memory person. And we are going to want to return, we don't want to return a 200 when we do this, right? We want to return a no content because that's really what a web API should be returning for something like this. Depends on you do things, but basically this should be enough to give us something and have it actually work. So now we're saving it, but we're not doing anything with it. So let's change our get so we can get this value back from board here, and we should be able to just put in here memory person. Now, what it's going to do, hopefully, assuming I didn't make any mistakes, is it should know that this is a record and sort of turn it into something that is logical for a web API. So let's do this again, send it in. So we've sent it in, we're still running, and let's do a get request, and there it is. So we pulled it back out again. So we passed it in, pulled it out, everything seems to be working wonderfully. Remember, let's see, we'll just change this here. So it's, say Jeff. Jeff's not 29. So we'll do this, and you can see I didn't highlight this, but there it is, a no content, no data comes back, that all works, and send it in, there we go. So we get Jeff out. So you can see that this stuff works pretty simply, not too much to it. So let's play around a little bit with this. Let's create a little bit more. This is just so you can see that when we return back stuff, we can return back more than just a single entity. So we can do this, and we're going to return back people, but I don't want to put it here. I want to create a new one to do that. So let's do a map get, and we'll say people. And we'll return people. So I think is what I called this. Yes, people. There you go. Wonderful. All right. Save that. And let's just do a quick get. So if we get this back, and there it is. So we get back our list as an array, JSON comes back. Everything is wonderful. Isn't that lovely? All right, so this is great. And now the next step, obviously, is to say, well, if we wanted to actually allow other people to start using this, we probably should make it a little easier for them. They don't want to sit here and run things this way all the time. So how would they do it? Well, we want to probably add Swagger to our code. So there's a couple things we have to do to make that work. And the first thing is we need to include a package reference. So let me just grab that code. This is one thing, how we got this, we talked about the implicit usings and stuff like that. This is one of those things it's not going to know what to do with. So we have to tell it, hey, I want swashbuckle.aspnet.core, and that's the version we're getting back. So I'm going to add that to my csproj file. And then we're going to change this at the top here. So assuming I get all this right, let's see. I don't want this one anymore. Let's replace that with all these things. So what are we doing? Well, this is where, because we're adding in a service, we're going to use the builder stuff. So web application create builder, because this allows us to do things like builder.services.add Swagger and other things. So this allows us to make this all work correctly. And then we still have our app builder, except instead of the way it had it before, I'm now, coming off of builder.build. I'm going to tell it to use Swagger and then use Swagger UI. And that's how that should work. And if this works correctly, that's a big if, but we'll see what we got here. Come on, baby. So now it's got to go out and get the stuff. All right, good. So it's listening. We're going to use port 5000 just because, we can. So let's see. I might have to make this bigger. Hang on a second. So if we go to localhost 5,000. Well, 5,000. I wanted 5,000. Thank you very much. Well, 3,000 should work too, but yeah. There it is. So now we've got our name, and there's all these things you can change if you're familiar with Swagger and Swashbuckle and how all that stuff works. It all works the same way here, but that's all you need so you can try out the different things. There's the get, there's the post, there's the put, the delete, and the get people. And we can try them all out here. So we can say try it out, yeah, execute the darn thing, and there it is, and there's our results. Isn't that lovely? You can do the same thing up here. You can do a post. You can say, I want to send it into, I'll say Chris. Well, I have to do try it out first. Otherwise, I can't type in there. All right, so we'll say Chris. And we're going to say he is, I don't know, 30. And I can execute that. Come down here and you can see I got a 204, which is what I'm supposed to get. And then if I come up here and try out the get, I should get back Chris, 30. Wonderful. All right. That's the super fast minimal API demo. So, any questions?
Hey, Rob,
Where you what?
I was going to ask you, how do you express parameters, incoming parameters, and gets in the minimal notation?
So it's similar to this. I mean, that's basically what we're doing here. So you could say you can have different things in here. So you could have query strings and other pieces that would be inside here. So if you wanted to have like an ID and some parameter,
Okay,
you could do
gotcha.
things like that.
Cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. The thing you guys want to probably look at is find it. Dan Fowler's gist or gist or however you say the damn thing at GitHub. Sorry, David Fowler. When I say Dan Fowler, David Fowler. He has minimal APIs, MD out there, so you can go back to his gist and read all about it. So let's see. This should. I want to make sure I've got the right URL here. So hang on a second. Yep. All right. So I'll post this and we can put it someplace else if you can't see this part, but let's put this up here. But this is that bigger. So this is where all the documentation is for minimal APIs. So there you go. And it's got a lot more stuff in it, including authorization, cores, the parameter bindings, the stuff that you were asking about, Mark, stuff like that. So there you go. You can also find it, a link to it if you go to Hanselman's blog. He's got the link in there. He's also got some documentation that he pulled out of the David Fowler stuff. So good place to go to read up on this stuff. All right. Questions? Well then, I put you all to sleep.
Oh, if nobody else is going to ask, I'll ask you one more having to do with parameters. With the posts, usually you only get like one that's like an object. Can you do multiple there? Based on the syntax, it looks like you can kind of have more flexibility.
I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to look in the documentation and see what's in there. But oh, the one thing it doesn't do right now, it doesn't natively bind to forms, but you can get it to work. I think in Hanselman's post he has it coming in from a form file, but I don't know if that does everything that you'd want. Let's see. So that's the only thing that I think they haven't got working yet.
Cool.
So
Thanks, Rob.
that's all I got.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, master of the minimal. So, thanks much for everybody coming, and we're going to try and keep having these meetings into next year. As I said, the meeting in 2 weeks, that's a 1-hour meeting from 7 to 8. Rich Ross from Microsoft is going to show you some real cool new stuff happening for developers in the GitHub space. I think that would be worthwhile for you to look at. Code Spaces is part of it. And then keep an eye open for emails. We're going to try and the first weekend in January, we're going to try and throw together a code camp for 1 or 2 days. So that'll have lots of sessions, and that would be a Friday and Saturday if it works out as we did last year. So stay safe and have a good night.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.